Hello, welcome to episode 151 of the Book Binge, where this week we are doing another book review of a classic that I read relatively recently, and that clicked super well for some, albeit somewhat strange reasons. This is East of Eden by John Steinbeck, a book that is actually quite popular even amongst friends or acquaintances, Discord acquaintances of mine who don't typically read classics, or who, if I'm going to put it lightly, find people who read classics to be rather snobbish for some reason. But this one is one that works for a lot of people for several different reasons, and I want to talk about several of those reasons today, because this was one that I was very excited for before going into it, one that I was looking greatly forward to, one of my most anticipated books ever. Did it live up to that hype? I would say yes, but it definitely surprised me in some ways that I wasn't expecting, of course, as per the definition of surprised. But let's just move on into the normal part of the review with the good of East of Eden. The primary thing that I'm going to point out in this review is John Steinbeck's use of allegory and analogy throughout the story. Now, most of this comes down to a biblical allegory based upon the Cain and Abel story from Genesis in the Bible. So if you are familiar with that story in any way, shape, or form, you're going to get a little bit more out of this book than, say, you might otherwise get if you're not familiar with the story. The book does kind of go into it in a somewhat metatextual way, I guess, to a degree, once or twice. Not in like a, making it so obvious that it's like painful kind of way, but it definitely does make itself clear. It wears that influence on its sleeve, so to speak, but it is a very important part of the story. It is a lot of what drives the character work and a lot of what makes that character work land so well. In addition to the biblical allegory going on in the story, you'll also have a lot of analogy going on in the cyclical nature of the work. You'll see a lot of the allegorical elements coming back multiple times in a sort of loop, you could say. Specifically, the Cain and Abel story is not just told through two of the characters, the equivalents or whatever. It's told through those two characters and everyone around them, and then it's also repeated a little bit in the next generation. That's about as far as you can say about it without getting spoilery to an extent, if you could consider it spoilery, considering its inspiration of the Cain and Abel story. But the cyclical nature of the narrative is surprisingly compelling, even though, when you've seen it once, it's just like, oh, you're gonna do this again, and it like actually works because all of these characters are just so independent anyway. Speaking of characters, in fact, the next thing that I really want to praise in East of Eden is the character and caricature balance that John Steinbeck strikes. In my weekly updates and reading wrap-ups and stuff like that I've done on the channel, when I've talked about this book in one way or another at one time or another, praising it for various things, one of the main things I brought up was that John Steinbeck does character work in East of Eden unlike anything I've ever read, and unlike anything I'm probably ever going to read through the rest of my life. Nobody has taken characters and made them so clearly based on something and meant to represent something, while them still being very individualized, very different, and fully human despite the caricature that they are based on. They're differentiated despite multi-generations of the story. As I said before, this is part of what makes the cyclical nature of the narrative work so well, is because the characters work, and even though certain elements of the Cain and Abel allegory are repeated a couple of times, they play out differently because the characters are different, and it's just genius the way that Steinbeck was able to make this work. It really was quite the feat that he managed to achieve with East of Eden. It's, it's very obvious that when Steinbeck was writing this novel that he intended it to be his novel, the novel that he wrote, where if there was the novel to exist, the single novel that he was known for, this was the one that he intended for that to be as he was writing it. He considered it his magnum opus, and really considering the quality of a lot of what he managed to achieve and how uniquely that stands out amongst the crowd of just American literature and any other kind of literature, quite frankly, it's just astounding. But another thing that I do want to praise East of Eden for, besides just the characters and the analogy and allegory elements, is the setting and the multiple settings throughout, I should say. It takes a while to get to the advertised setting, as you might see it on the back of the book, because most of the book does take place in the Salinas Valley in California, but it does take a surprisingly long time before it actually reaches that point. I was surprised by this when I first read it, but everything leading up to that is still very good, and both of these settings are very different and play a big role in the characterization of basically all of the major players. And the settings are fully realized, they're unique, they are distinct, they are very good. Both the East Coast and the West Coast settings have a different tone as well. Not only are the settings themselves distinct, but the way in which they are treated by the pros are also different as well. And that just really makes it stand out in a way that, like, I can't really think of any other example off the top of my head, kind of similar to the way that characters were treated. The way that locations had their own tone despite being somewhat similar in some other senses, just based off of how the characters interacted or thought about those areas and the way they interact with the narrative itself. The advertised setting as well as Salinas Valley has multiple arcs to it, because really the first act of the book is everything pre-Salinas Valley, and then everything else is within that setting, and there are multiple arcs to that. The new characters and the collision of other stories set in the background comes to satisfying fruition. There's a little bit of stuff in the first part of the book that you'll be like, how is this relevant? This doesn't really make sense to be talking about this. And like, once it is relevant, you obviously understand why it's relevant. But that also actually brings me to the bad of East of Eden, because despite how masterful this novel is, there are a couple of gripes that I did have with it, albeit minor. The main thing that I want to talk about in this case is that certain moments did take me out of it. The Hamilton storyline in the first part, which is in the Salinas Valley, but is kind of unrelated to the plot on the East Coast, where the majority of like the actual plot in part 1 takes place, and even maybe the first half of part 2 as well, I think, maybe, if I'm remembering correctly. You know, kind of it feels a little off. It doesn't seem relevant, so it comes off a little strangely. This is also partially because the Hamilton family is in some degree a self-insert on Steinbeck's part. I personally found these self-insert moments to be a little bit mediocre. I didn't feel like they were entirely necessary, although I do understand Steinbeck's desire to keep those moments, because he, as a narrator, is actually self-insert. He is canonically the author of this book, John Steinbeck, the son of, oh man, I'm forgetting her name off the top of my head, but the Lady Hamilton, the Mother Hamilton, is the actual name of his mother. So like, this family is in some sense a self-insert. So again, I understand why he wanted to include this, but I don't fully believe that side of the story was entirely necessary, because like, the very brief minor tangents that he goes on, like I said, they're very brief, they're minor, they're not super important, but he does go on a couple minor tangents in the story related to the self-insert nature that just don't really feel necessary, in my opinion. And it did, hamper a tiny bit of my experience at a couple of very specific points. Like I said, sometimes it took me out of the story just a little bit. But another thing that I didn't have a problem with, but that I think some potential readers would have a problem with, or that might keep a couple of people from trying out the book, is that the allegory might feel a little bit contrived to you. One might also hate the biblical undertones of that analogy, because, that's a lot of the point of the story. It digs at a core aspect of human nature as depicted by the Cain of Abel story, and some people just might not really connect with that as a general rule. I think it's all part of the journey and expressly the point of the story, as I said, and I didn't have a problem with it because the way that it was utilized was so smooth and so well done that I don't really feel like I have a place in complaining about it. I also think that the allegorical is meant to be the canvas on which Steinbeck paints human nature, as I said before. It tells the story of a core aspect of humanity, as the Cain and Abel story once did, and I think that the way that Steinbeck utilized that was brilliant. He used these caricatures, these ideals, these undertones, these specific things that he was trying to say with the book, or at least to some degree was trying to say, but was able to paint characters on top of it that were fully realized and unique, in settings that were fully realized and unique, that just really worked to bring forth the themes that he was trying to talk about. It really, really worked for me. As for the ugly, I think certain depictions of a couple of characters could come off as ugly to some people as well. Most notably with one of the female characters. Some people might read it and think, oh, well, Steinbeck clearly hates women just based off of the way he portrays his character. Again, I don't think that's actually what's going on. I think there's a deeper part of that as a result of the allegory and the themes that he's trying to portray, but as discussed by various other people on certain different channels, most notably the How to Read East of Eden video on Ben McAvoy's channel. If you were to watch that video, you would be familiar with the fact that John Steinbeck didn't have a great love life up to the point of writing East of Eden. And I believe he started writing the novel while in the midst of his second divorce or something like that, before he got married to his third wife, whom he did actually have a great experience with. But his love life and his experience with women up to that point probably influenced his depiction of Kathy within the story. And so some people might read Kathy's portions and think, wow, that's a pretty ugly description of women in general. And again, I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's as simple as that, but some people might get really hung up on that. I've seen a couple of one-star reviews really pointing that out as being the issue that they had. There are also certain moralistic standards Steinbeck holds the allegory up to that are pretty, obvious based off of the biblical nature of the obvious reasons, like I said. And so some might take issue with that. It's kind of one of those blurring the lines between what is the story and what is the biblical allegory. And just as I mentioned in the bad, like, some people might not take too kindly to this. I didn't have a problem with it. I don't think many readers are going to have a huge problem with it. This book has a very high average rating on Goodreads, even higher than I think is typical. The vast majority of people who've read this book rate it 5 stars, for example, so clearly it works for the majority of readers. The people who take issue with the moralistic standards that Steinbeck utilizes in East of Eden are probably going to be the same people who don't like the allegorical and thematic presence of the story in the first place anyway, so they're all kind of one and the same as far as that goes. Based on the general reception, as I just said before, 4.5 plus stars on Goodreads, the people who are reading this are loving it, and the people who might explicitly take issue with it are probably, maybe, potentially choosing to avoid it on purpose because they know it won't work for them. So as a recommendation from me to you on whether you should read East of Eden if you have not yet, I absolutely do recommend this, especially if you want to see the most masterful handling of characters built within a mold. That, they're not the most real characters that you've ever met in a book ever, but the way that Steinbeck, like I said at the top of this review, in The Good, was able to realize characters while making them represent something very specific and fulfill a role in the story, so to speak. That could feel contrived if done poorly, but doesn't feel contrived because he did it so masterfully, is alone worth reading East of Eden for. Never has anybody felt so independent and real and human while also being meant to represent something in any book I've ever read. And I've said it before, I don't think I'm ever going to experience another book that does this to this degree, and especially not as well as Steinbeck did. It's almost as if there's a foundational truth to those old stories, whether you believe in their historical accuracy, let's say, or not. It doesn't really matter. It's meant to carry a human truth, a truth to the human condition. That's what Steinbeck was able to do with East of Eden, and sort of bring some of those, biblical themes, I guess, to a modern audience, and it just worked super, super well. Whether they actually happen or not, as I said, doesn't matter. It's the foundational truth to those stories that I think really carries forth in this book. So if you're in any way interested in experiencing any of that, you should read this. And if you aren't somebody who is explicitly inherently opposed to some of the ideas carried within, or to some of the things that I've praised or talked about throughout this review, you should check this out as well, because it could wind up being a surprise as one of your favorite books. Like I said, I know plenty of people who otherwise don't really read classics, or even a couple of people who like make fun of people for reading a lot of classics, but who have read East of Eden and absolutely loved it. So that should speak for itself. East of Eden is, in short, a story of caricatures made human, and it is an immensely special book in its achievements there. So I recommend this book, and that's going to be the end of this review. I'll be back on Thursday with a little bit of a different video, going back to a story time format, talking about how I started to become slowly converted to a Kindle and Audible lifestyle, which I didn't expect to happen once upon a not very long time ago. So I'll see you guys in that video if you check it out, but I'll be back regardless in the next video.